I'm Major Natasha Morgan, 28, and I earned my commission the hard way, cut off at 18. I built a career on discipline and service. For years, I paid the price in missed holidays and deployments while standing by the one person who taught me honor, my grandfather. But when my parents mocked me at his will reading, expecting everything, I chose boundaries over begging, and everything changed. Have you ever been dismissed or humiliated by the very people you once would have done anything for? Tell me your story in the comments. You're not alone. Before I dive in, drop where you're watching from. And if you've ever had to stand up for yourself after being wronged, hit like and subscribe for more true stories about setting boundaries and reclaiming your worth. What happened next might surprise you. Growing up in the Morgan house meant understanding appearances mattered more than substance. My parents operated their lives like a carefully curated magazine spread: the right neighborhood, the right cars, the right dinner parties with the right people. They'd chosen their friends based on net worth and their conversations based on what would impress. Success, in their world, came with a price tag and a title that looked good on Christmas cards. I noticed the subtle dismissals early. When I'd mention wanting to help people or serve something bigger than myself, my mother would redirect the conversation to my college applications, or my father would suggest I consider practical careers that offered real security. The word service seemed to leave a bitter taste in their mouths, like they'd accidentally sipped spoiled milk. My grandfather lived in the guest house behind our main property, close enough to be convenient, far enough to maintain his independence. While my parents saw him as their financial safety net, I saw him as the most fascinating person in our family. His study walls displayed medals and commendations from 2 tours in Vietnam, photographs with men who'd trusted him with their lives, letters from soldiers he'd commanded who still wrote to thank him decades later. "Tell me about this one again," I'd say, pointing to a particular medal during our Sunday afternoon visits. "Bronze Star," he'd explain, his weathered hands gentle as he lifted the decoration. "Not for me, really. For the men who didn't make it home." My parents would roll their eyes when they caught these conversations. "Dad's war stories again," my mother would sigh, as if his service was an embarrassing hobby rather than a defining chapter of his life. They'd inherited his discipline when it came to financial planning, but none of his values regarding sacrifice or honor. The first real crack appeared during my senior year of high school. I'd mentioned considering ROTC programs during a family dinner with their country club friends. The table fell silent. My father's jaw tightened, and my mother's smile became forced and brittle. "She's just exploring options," my mother said quickly, her voice carrying that particular tone she used when damage control was necessary. "We're looking at law school, actually. Corporate law. Very lucrative field." Later that night, they cornered me in the kitchen. "We didn't sacrifice everything to build this life, so you could throw it away playing soldier," my father said, his voice low but sharp. "You have opportunities most kids would kill for. What if serving my country is the opportunity one want? That's not a career, Natasha. That's a phase. A dangerous, poorly paid phase that leads nowhere." My grandfather said nothing during these exchanges, but I caught him watching from the doorway sometimes, his expression unreadable. He'd served his country for over 20 years, earned the respect of everyone who knew him, and built a fortune through disciplined investing and smart real estate decisions. Yet my parents spoke about military service like it was charity work, noble enough in theory, impractical in reality. The mockery became less subtle as months passed. When military recruiters called, my mother would answer sweetly, then hang up and announce to whoever was listening that they were trying to steal our daughter for their war machine. When I attended a Veterans Day ceremony with my grandfather, my father made jokes about Natasha's little patriotic phase to his golf buddies. These weren't explosive arguments. They were something worse: death by 1,000 cuts, each small dismissal designed to make me question my instincts, my values, my sense of what mattered. They wanted me to choose their version of success, and they'd erode my confidence until I did. But sitting with my grandfather in his study, surrounded by the evidence of a life lived with purpose, I felt something they couldn't touch. He never directly contradicted my parents, never inserted himself into our family dynamics, but his presence provided a steady counterpoint to their pressure. Some paths require courage, he told me once, polishing a photograph of his unit. Not everyone understands that kind of courage. Did your parents support your decision to enlist? He smiled, the lines around his eyes deepening. They thought I was crazy. Said I was throwing my life away. Funny how that turned out. I understood then that this tension wasn't new. My grandfather had fought these same battles with his own family, had chosen service over security, had proven that honor and success weren't mutually exclusive. The difference was that he'd had time to demonstrate his path's value. I was still at the beginning, still vulnerable to doubt and criticism. The family dinners grew increasingly uncomfortable. My parents would discuss my future like I wasn't there, making plans that assumed I'd eventually come to my senses. They talked about connections they could leverage, internships they could arrange, the corporate track that would lead to the right kind of success. I started spending more time in my grandfather's study, listening to stories about leadership under pressure, about making decisions when lives hung in the balance, about the satisfaction that came from serving something greater than personal ambition. He never explicitly encouraged my military interests, but he didn't discourage them either. Instead, he simply presented the evidence of his life, the respect he'd earned, the legacy he'd built, the peace he'd found in knowing he'd served with honor. My parents misinterpreted my increasing distance as teenage rebellion rather than growing certainty. They assumed I'd eventually succumb to their practical arguments, their financial pressure, their emotional manipulation. They'd built their entire relationship with me on the foundation of control, and they couldn't imagine I might choose a different foundation entirely. The warning signs were everywhere, but they chose not to see them. Every time I mentioned service, sacrifice, or honor, they responded with lectures about security, status, and sensible choices. They were so convinced of their path's superiority that they couldn't recognize mine as legitimate. Looking back, I realized those months were my preparation period. Not just for the confrontation that was coming, but for the life I was choosing, a life where other people's approval wouldn't determine my direction, where my worth wouldn't depend on their acceptance, where I could carry forward the values my grandfather had quietly modeled despite their constant resistance. The stage was set. The battle lines were drawn. And I was finally ready to choose my side. The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening in March, over dinner at our dining room table. My parents had spent the first course discussing their friends' children. Sarah was starting at Goldman Sachs. Michael had been accepted to Yale Law. Jennifer was engaged to a pharmaceutical executive. The subtext was clear: successful families produced successful children who made sensible choices. "We've been thinking about your college plans," my mother began, her tone deceptively casual. The Brennans mentioned that Jennifer's fiancé could arrange an internship at his company. Excellent stepping stone for pre-law. I set down my fork carefully. I've made my decision about college. I'm enlisting in the Army after graduation. The silence was immediate and absolute. My father's wine glass paused halfway to his lips. My mother's smile froze in place. My grandfather continued eating, but I noticed his shoulders straighten slightly. "That's not funny, Natasha," my mother said finally, her voice tight. "I'm not joking. I've already spoken with a recruiter. The paperwork is ready." My father slammed his glass down hard enough to slosh wine onto the white tablecloth. "Like hell you are. This is my choice." "No," my mother said, her voice rising. "This is teenage rebellion disguised as principle. You're throwing away every advantage we've given you, every sacrifice we've made." "What sacrifices?" The question came out sharper than I'd intended, but I didn't take it back. My father stood up, his face flushed. "Everything we've built, everything we've worked for, was for you. Private schools, tutoring, connections, opportunities. And you want to throw it all away to play war. I want to serve my country. I want to do something that matters." "Matters?" My mother's voice cracked. "What matters is security. What matters is building a life that can't be destroyed by politics or budget cuts or some general's whims." The argument escalated quickly from there. They attacked the military as an institution, questioned my intelligence, suggested I was being manipulated by recruiters and my grandfather's outdated values. Every word was designed to wound, to make me reconsider, to break down my resolve. "You're being selfish," my father said. You're choosing strangers over your own family. You're choosing disappointment over success, my mother added. Do you understand what people will think? I understand that your opinion of other people's opinions isn't my problem. That's when the threats started. Financial cutoff. Removal from the will. Social exile from family functions. They'd tell everyone I'd abandoned them, chosen violence over education, thrown away my potential for the sake of teenage idealism. You're not our daughter anymore if you do this, my mother said, her voice cold and final. The words hung in the air like a physical presence. I felt something fundamental shift inside me, a bridge burning behind me that I couldn't rebuild even if I wanted to. My grandfather finally spoke. That's enough. His voice was quiet, but it carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. My parents turned to him, expecting support for their position. Instead, he stood up and placed his hand on my shoulder. Natasha's old enough to make her own choices, and brave enough to live with the consequences. Dad, you can't seriously support this insanity, my father said. I support courage. I always have. The room fell silent again, but this silence felt different. Final. My grandfather's hand on my shoulder anchored me while my parents' words tried to cut me loose. If you walk away from this family, don't come crawling back when reality hits, my mother said. Don't expect us to rescue you when your little adventure falls apart. I looked at each of them, memorizing their faces in this moment. I won't. That night, I packed my essential belongings while my parents made phone calls to relatives, explaining their version of the story. I could hear fragments through my bedroom door, phrases like completely irrational, devastating betrayal, and cutting her off completely. My grandfather appeared in my doorway as I was folding my last sweater. You sure about this path? Yes, sir. He nodded once. Then walk it with honor. Don't let their fear become your doubt. The next morning, I left for the recruiting station with a single bag and my grandfather's words echoing in my mind. My parents had made their choice just as clearly as I'd made mine. The difference was that I was walking toward something I believed in, while they were running from everything they couldn't control. The disownment was complete by the time I finished basic training. They'd changed the locks, removed my photos from the family room, and told their friends I'd chosen the military over my family. The narrative they created painted me as ungrateful, rebellious, and ultimately disposable. But sitting in my grandfather's study that last night, surrounded by evidence of a life lived with purpose, I realized they'd given me the greatest gift possible. They'd freed me to become who I was meant to be. My grandfather understood this better than anyone. He'd fought his own family's expectations, chosen service over safety, and built a legacy that transcended their small definitions of success. Now he was watching me make the same choice, and his quiet support mattered more than all their loud opposition. The relationship had crossed a line that couldn't be walked back. But for the first time in years, I felt like I was walking in the right direction. My earliest memories of my grandfather weren't about his military service. They were about his presence. While my parents fluttered through their social obligations and business meetings, he provided the steady rhythm that anchored our household. He woke at 5:30 every morning, made coffee in the kitchen of the guest house, and read the newspaper cover to cover before anyone else stirred. I started joining him for these quiet morning routines when I was 7 years old, padding across the backyard in my pajamas to knock on his door. He'd let me in without question, pour me orange juice in a small glass, and we'd sit together at his kitchen table while the sun came up. "Why do you get up so early, Grandpa?" "Discipline," he'd say simply. "Some habits are worth keeping." His guest house felt different from our main house. Where my parents had filled our rooms with expensive furniture and decorative objects designed to impress visitors, his space contained only what he needed. But every item told a story. The desk where he wrote letters to old army friends. The bookshelf lined with military history and philosophy. The wooden box where he kept his medals, not displayed but carefully preserved. He'd been a major himself, though he never used the title in civilian life. 2 tours in Vietnam as an infantry officer, leading men through some of the war's most difficult campaigns. The Bronze Star my mother dismissed so casually had been earned during a firefight where he'd risked his life to evacuate wounded soldiers under enemy fire. "Were you scared?" I asked him once, studying the citation that accompanied the medal. Terrified, he said without hesitation. But being scared doesn't excuse you from doing what's right. This honesty was what separated him from my parents' carefully managed presentations. He didn't romanticize war or military service. He spoke about leadership as a burden as much as an honor, about the weight of making decisions that affected other people's lives, about coming home to a country that didn't always understand what its veterans had sacrificed. But he also spoke about the satisfaction that came from serving something greater than personal gain. The bonds formed under pressure that lasted decades. The knowledge that when the stakes were highest, he'd chosen courage over comfort. My parents had inherited his financial discipline, but none of his deeper values. They'd watched him build a real estate portfolio worth millions through careful planning and smart investments, but they'd missed the foundation of integrity that made his success meaningful. "Your grandfather's done well for himself," my father would say when discussing family finances. Military pension, real estate investments, conservative spending habits. He set us all up nicely. They spoke about his wealth like it was their birthright, his success like it was their inheritance waiting to happen. But they never asked him about the principles that had guided his decisions, the character that had enabled his achievements, the service that had shaped his worldview. I was the one who wanted to hear those stories. I'd sit in his study for hours, listening to accounts of leading soldiers who were barely older than I was now, making decisions in situations where wrong choices meant people died. He'd show me letters from men he'd commanded, written years after the war ended, thanking him for bringing them home safely. "Leadership isn't about giving orders," he'd explain. "It's about earning the right to be followed. And that right has to be earned fresh every day." These conversations happened while my parents were busy with their social calendar, their business meetings, their endless pursuit of the next status symbol. They saw my time with my grandfather as harmless bonding with an elderly relative. They couldn't see that he was teaching me a different way to measure success. The contrast became more obvious as I grew older. My parents' friends competed over vacation destinations, car models, and private school admissions. Their conversations centered on acquisition and appearance, on who had what and how much it cost. Success was external, visible, easily quantified. My grandfather measured success differently. He talked about the soldiers who'd stayed in touch, the community organizations he'd quietly supported, the young veterans he'd mentored over the years. His achievements couldn't be displayed at dinner parties or discussed at country club gatherings. "Real wealth isn't what you accumulate," he told me once. "It's what you contribute." My parents missed this entirely. They saw his medals as historical curiosities, his veteran friends as reminders of an outdated era, his values as quaint but impractical in modern times. They'd taken his financial lessons while dismissing his moral ones. This selective inheritance explained their shock when I chose military service. They'd assumed I'd follow their path, take the money, ignore the principles, prioritize comfort over character. They couldn't understand that I'd been paying attention to the grandfather they'd overlooked, learning from the man they'd reduced to a retirement account balance. The irony was that my grandfather had been preparing me all along, not through lectures or direct guidance, but through example. Every morning routine, every story about wartime leadership, every quiet demonstration of integrity had been building toward the moment when I'd have to choose my own path. He never told me to join the military. He never criticized my parents directly. But he'd shown me an alternative to their values, a different definition of success, a way of living that prioritized service over self-interest. When the confrontation finally came, when my parents disowned me for choosing honor over their version of security, my grandfather's support wasn't surprising. It was the natural culmination of 18 years of quiet mentorship, the logical result of lessons taught through lived example rather than empty words. The foundation had been laid long before the crisis. The bond had been built through thousands of small moments, morning conversations over coffee, afternoon talks in his study, quiet demonstrations of what it meant to live with purpose. My parents had assumed his influence was negligible because it wasn't loud or dramatic. They'd underestimated the power of consistent example, the weight of earned respect, the strength of a relationship built on shared values rather than shared genetics. That was their first mistake. It wouldn't be their last. Life after disownment moved in two distinct phases: the immediate shock of isolation, followed by the gradual discovery of who I was when stripped of external validation. Basic training began 3 weeks after I left home, and the intensity of military preparation left little time for emotional processing. Days started at 4:30 in the morning and ended after evening formation, every hour accounted for, every moment purposeful. The physical challenges weren't what surprised me, I'd prepared for those. The mental adjustment was harder. For 18 years, I'd lived with the assumption that family approval mattered, that disappointing the people who raised you carried real consequences. Suddenly finding myself completely cut off from that system felt like learning to breathe different air. My drill instructors pushed harder than my parents ever had, demanded more than any civilian authority figure I'd known, but their expectations felt clean somehow. Clear. Performance-based rather than manipulation-based. When Sergeant Martinez corrected my form during weapons training, he was trying to make me better, not control my life choices. "Natasha, you're thinking too hard," he said during a particularly frustrating afternoon on the rifle range. "Trust your training. Stop second-guessing yourself." The advice applied to more than marksmanship. I'd spent months questioning my decision, wondering if my parents were right about throwing my life away. But surrounded by other young soldiers who'd also chosen service over easier paths, I started to understand that second-guessing was a luxury I couldn't afford. Letters arrived sporadically from my grandfather, brief updates about his health and the neighborhood, carefully neutral about my parents' continuing anger. He never explicitly stated their position, but I could read between the lines. They were telling anyone who'd listen about my betrayal, my ingratitude, my complete abandonment of everything they'd provided. "Your parents are struggling with your choice," he wrote. "Some struggles take longer to resolve than others." The diplomatic language couldn't hide the reality. They weren't struggling with my choice, they were punishing me for it. Every mutual friend who stopped calling, every family invitation that didn't arrive, every social connection that suddenly dried up was evidence of their campaign to rewrite our family story. But something unexpected happened during those early months. The isolation forced me to develop resources I'd never needed before. Without family support to fall back on, I had to prove myself entirely through my own efforts. Without parental approval to chase, I had to find satisfaction in personal achievement and professional recognition. Military life rewarded the values my grandfather had modeled: discipline, integrity, commitment to something larger than individual ambition. The same characteristics my parents had dismissed as impractical became the foundation of my success in this new environment. Advanced individual training, leadership courses, first assignments, each step forward felt earned in ways my parents' achievements never had. No one had smoothed my path or opened doors through connections. Every promotion, every recognition, every opportunity came through demonstrated competence and earned respect. The loneliness was real, especially during holidays and family occasions that highlighted my absence from the world I'd known. But it was clean loneliness, honest isolation, not the emotional manipulation disguised as love that had characterized my parents' version of family connection. My grandfather's occasional phone calls became precious touchstones, brief conversations that reminded me I hadn't lost all family connection. We didn't discuss my parents directly, but his steady presence provided continuity between my old life and my new one. "How's the leadership training going?" he'd ask. "Challenging. Good challenging. The best kind. You learning anything useful?" That earning respect is harder than inheriting it. His chuckle carried approval I hadn't heard from family in months. Now that's wisdom worth having. These conversations revealed something important. I was becoming the person my grandfather had always seen in me, the person my parents had never allowed me to become. Free from their expectations and demands, I could explore my own capabilities, discover my own strengths, build my own identity. The military provided structure, but also freedom to fail or succeed based on my own efforts, freedom to build relationships based on mutual respect rather than family obligation, freedom to pursue goals that aligned with my values rather than their ambitions. Deployments came with their own challenges and revelations. Leading soldiers, making decisions under pressure, carrying responsibility for other people's safety and success. These experiences taught me lessons no civilian education could have provided. The confidence that came from proving myself in difficult circumstances was different from anything I'd felt in my parents' world. But the nights were still hard sometimes. Lying in my bunk, I'd wonder what family dinners were like without me, whether my parents ever regretted their ultimatum, whether the bridge between us could ever be repaired. The answer always came back the same: it didn't matter. They'd made their choice as definitively as I'd made mine. The family I'd been born into was gone, replaced by the community I'd chosen, the values I'd embraced, the life I was building through my own efforts. This realization was both devastating and liberating. Devastating because it meant accepting that the people who raised me would never understand or approve of who I'd become. Liberating because it meant their approval was no longer necessary for my happiness or success. By the end of my first enlistment, I understood that disownment had been a gift disguised as punishment. They'd freed me to become myself, to pursue a path aligned with my deepest values, to build a life that would have been impossible under their expectations. The scars were real. The sense of family loss was permanent. But the strength I'd discovered, the purpose I'd found, the person I'd become, these outweighed everything I'd sacrificed. I was no longer their daughter in any meaningful sense, but I was becoming the woman my grandfather had always believed I could be. By my 3rd year of service, I'd stopped checking my phone hopefully for messages from home. The silence had become normal, even comfortable. My parents had made their position clear through lawyers and bank statements, all financial support terminated, all family photos removed from their social media, all mutual connections informed of my abandonment of family values. But they'd underestimated how completely I could build a new life. The Army became my family. My fellow officers became my siblings. The mission became my purpose. And slowly, carefully, I began to understand that I was thriving in ways that would have been impossible under their roof. "Natasha, you've got potential for field-grade officer," Colonel Bradley said during my performance review. "Ever think about making this a career?" "Yes, sir. Every day." The conversation happened in his office at Fort Bragg, 3 years after the disownment, 2 years after my parents had stopped trying to contact me altogether. I'd been promoted twice, earned my jump wings, completed Ranger School, and was preparing for my first deployment as a platoon leader. The young woman who'd left their house with a single bag had become someone they wouldn't recognize, confident, capable, respected by people who'd earned the right to judge competence. My leadership skills had been tested under pressure and proven reliable. My decision-making had been trusted with other people's lives and proven sound. More importantly, I'd learned to measure success differently. Not by accumulated wealth or social status, but by lives impacted, missions accomplished, values upheld under pressure. The satisfaction that came from bringing all my soldiers home safely from a difficult operation was deeper than anything I'd felt in their carefully curated world. My grandfather's influence had become more obvious with time and distance. The morning discipline he'd modeled served me well during early reveille formations. The quiet integrity he'd demonstrated guided my interactions with subordinates and superiors alike. The service before self mentality he'd lived became the foundation of my leadership philosophy. Meanwhile, my parents were discovering that cutting me off had consequences they hadn't anticipated. Their friends' children were graduating from expensive colleges and starting corporate careers, providing ready-made conversation topics at social gatherings. But my absence from their narrative left awkward gaps they struggled to fill. "How's Natasha doing?" became a question they deflected rather than answered, a reminder of the daughter they'd disowned rather than the success story they'd planned to showcase. The empty seat at family holidays became more noticeable as years passed, the missing voice more obvious at celebrations. They began reaching out indirectly during my 4th year of service, tentative messages delivered through my grandfather that suggested reconciliation might be possible if I came to my senses about my career choice. These overtures always included conditions: I could come home if I left the military, rejoin the family if I pursued the education they'd originally wanted, reclaim my inheritance if I admitted my mistake. "They miss you," my grandfather said carefully during one of our phone calls. "They miss controlling me." That's different. The distinction mattered. They wanted their version of me back, compliant, dependent, aligned with their values and ambitions. They had no interest in the person I'd actually become, the officer who'd earned respect through demonstrated competence, the leader who'd found purpose in service to something greater than personal advancement. Their pride wouldn't allow them to acknowledge that my path had led to genuine success. To do so would require admitting that their values were incomplete, their definition of achievement too narrow, their treatment of my decision fundamentally wrong. So they continued to wait for me to fail, to need their rescue, to come crawling back with apologies and explanations. They assumed military service was a phase I'd eventually outgrow, a rebellion that would exhaust itself when reality set in. But reality had set in. I'd found my calling, proven my capabilities, and built a life that aligned with my deepest beliefs about purpose and service. The contrast with their world became more stark as time passed. They chased status and accumulation, while I pursued competence and contribution. The irony was that my grandfather's values had shaped me far more than their expectations ever had. His quiet example of integrity under pressure, service before self, earned respect rather than inherited privilege. These had become my guideposts in ways they'd never anticipated. He'd planted seeds during those morning conversations and afternoon talks in his study, seeds that had taken root despite their opposition, seeds that were now growing into a life they couldn't understand or control. Their financial threats had become irrelevant. I was earning my own way, building my own security, creating my own opportunities through merit rather than connection. Their social disapproval had become meaningless. The respect of fellow officers and the soldiers I led mattered more than country club acceptance. Most importantly, their emotional manipulation had lost its power. I no longer needed their approval to feel successful, their acceptance to feel worthy, their love to feel whole. The family I'd chosen through shared service and mutual respect provided everything their conditional affection had withheld. They'd intended disownment as punishment, a consequence severe enough to force my compliance. Instead, they'd created the conditions necessary for my growth into someone they'd never allowed me to become: independent, purposeful, strong enough to stand on my own convictions rather than their inherited expectations. The decision I'd made at 18 had proven correct in every way that mattered. Their decision to reject that choice was about to prove costly in ways they'd never imagined. The years between disownment and my grandfather's final illness passed in a blur of deployments, promotions, and personal growth. I'd made major by my 7th year of service, earned a Bronze Star during my 2nd deployment to Afghanistan, and been selected for the Command and General Staff College, the Army's premier professional military education for field-grade officers. My parents' world, meanwhile, had begun showing cracks they couldn't ignore. The 2008 financial crisis had hit their real estate investments hard. My father's consulting firm had lost several major clients. The comfortable lifestyle they'd maintained through borrowed money and anticipated inheritance suddenly looked precarious. They'd always assumed my grandfather's estate would solve their long-term security concerns. He owned commercial properties throughout the city, maintained a diverse investment portfolio, and had accumulated wealth that would easily support their retirement dreams. The estate planning they'd glimpsed suggested assets worth tens of millions. But they'd made a critical error in their calculations. They'd assumed inheritance was automatic rather than earned, that family connection guaranteed family legacy, that cutting me out would increase their share rather than jeopardize their position entirely. My grandfather had watched their financial struggles with the same quiet attention he'd paid to everything else. He'd seen them approach him for loans during particularly difficult months, observed their increasingly desperate attempts to maintain appearances, noted their growing dependence on his continued support. He'd also watched my military career with quiet pride, following promotions and achievements they refused to acknowledge, corresponding with me regularly while they maintained their silence, seeing firsthand the contrast between their values and mine. The transformation was complete by the time I reached my 10th year of service. The uncertain young woman who'd left their house had become a confident field-grade officer with a distinguished record and a clear sense of purpose. I'd led soldiers in combat, managed complex operations under pressure, earned the respect of colleagues and superiors through demonstrated competence. More importantly, I'd internalized the values my grandfather had modeled: integrity, service, humility in success, strength under pressure. These had become my natural responses to leadership challenges, my default approach to decision-making, my foundation for building relationships with subordinates and peers. My parents' attempts at reconciliation had evolved over the years from demanding my return to suggesting possible compromise. They'd begun hinting that my military service was admirable but temporary, a phase that had served its purpose and could now be concluded in favor of more practical pursuits. "Your grandfather mentioned you're doing well in the Army," my mother said during a rare phone call. "He's very proud. We're proud too, of course. But you've proven your point now. Isn't it time to think about what comes next?" "This is what comes next. This is my career." "But surely you want a family, a normal life, financial security?" The assumptions underlying her questions revealed how little she understood about the life I'd built. I had a family, the soldiers I led, the officers I served alongside, the community of professionals who'd chosen the same path. I had security, earned through competence, backed by performance, built on abilities they'd never tested. Most importantly, I had purpose. Every day brought opportunities to serve something greater than personal ambition, to lead people who'd volunteered to sacrifice for their country, to uphold values that transcended material success. Their world looked increasingly hollow by comparison. The social climbing, the appearance management, the constant worry about what others thought, these seemed like elaborate distractions from the business of actually living with meaning. My grandfather understood this better than anyone. Our conversations had become more philosophical as he aged, discussions about legacy and meaning, about what mattered when life was measured in impact rather than accumulation. "You've become the officer I always hoped you could be," he told me during one of my rare visits home on leave. I had a good example to follow. "Your parents don't see it that way. Their choice. My path is clear with or without their approval." He smiled, the expression carrying satisfaction I'd rarely seen from him. "That's exactly what I hoped you'd say." The conversation happened in his study, surrounded by the same medals and photographs that had inspired my original interest in military service. But now I understood their meaning differently, not as relics of past glory, but as evidence of a life lived with purpose, choices made for reasons beyond personal advancement. I was carrying forward that legacy in ways my parents had never imagined, building my own version of honorable service, earning my own place in the tradition of Americans who'd chosen duty over comfort. The foundation had been laid. The values had been internalized. The choice had been validated through years of successful service. All that remained was for my parents to discover the consequences of their decision to abandon the daughter who'd chosen honor over their approval, service over their security, integrity over their inheritance. The reckoning was coming. They just didn't know it yet. My grandfather's health began declining during my 10th year of service, subtle changes that became obvious only during my infrequent visits home. The morning routines that had defined his days for decades started later, ended earlier. The precise posture that had marked his bearing began showing the effects of age and the old combat injuries he'd carried for 50 years. But his mind remained sharp, his judgment clear, his understanding of family dynamics more acute than ever. He'd been watching my parents' behavior during his declining years with the same attention he'd paid to everything else in his life: careful, analytical, comprehensive. They'd become more attentive to his needs as his health deteriorated, but their motives remained transparent. Doctors' appointments became opportunities to discuss estate planning. Family dinners became venues for subtle reminders of their devotion and my absence. Their care came with underlying calculations about inheritance and expectations about gratitude. "They think they're being clever," he told me during one of our phone conversations. 40 years of marriage to your grandmother taught me to recognize manipulation. Are they taking good care of you? They're taking care of themselves. Different thing entirely. The distinction mattered to him more than they realized. He'd spent his entire life earning respect through service, building relationships through demonstrated integrity, creating value through contribution rather than extraction. Their transactional approach to his final years offended something fundamental in his character. Meanwhile, they'd grown increasingly confident about their inheritance prospects. The real estate holdings alone were worth substantial money, and they'd glimpsed enough financial statements to estimate the total estate value. Their retirement planning assumed access to these assets. Their current spending reflected anticipated wealth. Their lifestyle had been calibrated to inherited rather than earned resources. They'd also assumed my continued exile would work in their favor, that 10 years of disownment would increase their share of his legacy. They spoke about my absence like it was a business advantage, one less claimant on the estate they considered rightfully theirs. But they'd fundamentally misunderstood their father's character. His wealth hadn't been accumulated for their benefit. It had been built through the same disciplined approach he'd brought to everything else, invested with the same long-term thinking that had guided his military career, managed with the same integrity that had defined his leadership style. More importantly, they'd never grasped the connection between his values and his legacy planning. They saw his estate as an asset to be inherited rather than a trust to be earned, money to be divided rather than principles to be carried forward. I understood this better than they did, partly because I'd internalized his teachings, partly because my military experience had taught me how values translate into action under pressure. Real legacy wasn't about accumulating wealth, it was about identifying people capable of stewarding that wealth according to the principles that had created it. The phone call came on a Thursday morning while I was preparing for a training exercise at Fort Leavenworth. My grandfather had suffered a massive heart attack during his morning routine, the same disciplined schedule he'd maintained for decades. He was in intensive care, stable but critical, and the doctors weren't optimistic about long-term recovery. I took emergency leave immediately, driving straight from Kansas to the hospital where he'd been taken. The intensive care unit felt sterile and foreign after months of military bases and field exercises, but seeing him connected to machines and monitors made everything suddenly real in ways I hadn't prepared for. My parents were already there, of course, maintaining vigil with the dedication they'd never shown during his healthy years. They looked exhausted but determined, committed to demonstrating their devotion now that it might matter for estate planning purposes. "Natasha," my mother said when I appeared in the waiting room. Her voice carried surprise and something that might have been relief. "We didn't expect you to come. He's my grandfather." The simplicity of the statement hung between us, highlighting everything that had gone wrong with our family dynamics. I was there because blood mattered, because respect mattered, because some obligations transcended personal disagreements. They were there because inheritance mattered, because appearances mattered, because financial security trumped emotional honesty. But seeing him lying there, reduced by illness to the frail body that housed an indomitable spirit, reminded me that time was finite for all of us. Whatever my parents' motives, whatever calculations they were making, my grandfather deserved better than family discord during his final days. "How is he?" I asked. "Weak," my father said, "but stable. The doctors think he might have a few weeks, maybe more if he responds to treatment." Those weeks became a strange interlude in our family story, a temporary ceasefire in the conflict that had defined us for the past decade. We took shifts at his bedside, maintained awkward conversation in the waiting room, shared meals in the hospital cafeteria without discussing the fundamental disagreements that had driven us apart. My grandfather slipped in and out of consciousness, sometimes lucid enough for brief conversations, other times lost in medication and the body's effort to heal itself. During his clear moments, he seemed almost amused by the sudden family reunion his illness had created. "Funny how a heart attack brings everyone together," he said during one of our private moments. "Some things are more important than arguments." "Smart girl. Always knew you were smart." He passed away peacefully on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after the initial attack, while I was holding his hand and reading him letters from soldiers he'd mentored over the years. The end came quietly, without drama, the way he'd lived most of his life, with dignity, purpose, and attention to what really mattered. The funeral was everything he would have wanted: military honors, a flag-draped casket, veterans from 3 different wars serving as pallbearers. The chapel was packed with people whose lives he'd influenced: former soldiers, community leaders, business associates who'd respected his integrity. My parents played their parts perfectly, accepting condolences with appropriate grief, speaking about his service and character with suitable reverence. But I could see them calculating even during the service, estimating the estate value based on the quality of the mourners, the size of the gathering, the obvious respect he'd commanded. The will reading was scheduled for the following week, a formality that would confirm what everyone assumed, that his substantial estate would pass to his surviving family according to conventional expectations and practical considerations. They had no idea what was coming. Neither, if I'm honest, did I. But my grandfather had been planning this moment for years, watching our choices, evaluating our characters, making decisions about legacy that went far deeper than simple financial distribution. The man who'd built his wealth through discipline and integrity had also planned its distribution according to the same principles. The reckoning was about to begin, and 10 years of family discord were about to reveal their true cost. The law office felt like a stage set for the final act of our family drama. Mahogany furniture, leather-bound books, oil paintings of stern judges, everything designed to convey dignity and permanence, the weight of legal tradition and binding decisions. My parents arrived early, dressed in their best black suits, carrying themselves with the subdued confidence of people about to inherit substantial wealth. They'd spent the week since the funeral making preliminary plans, which properties to keep, which investments to liquidate, how to divide the assets most advantageously for tax purposes. I came directly from the base, wearing my dress blue uniform because it felt appropriate to honor my grandfather's memory with the same formality he'd brought to important occasions. The uniform also reminded everyone in the room that I'd chosen a different path, built a different life, earned respect through service rather than expectation. "Natasha," my mother said as I took a seat across from them. "You look very official. This seems like an official occasion." The lawyer, a distinguished man in his 60s who'd handled my grandfather's affairs for over 20 years, arranged papers on his desk with careful precision. He'd known our family through multiple generations, witnessed our dysfunction firsthand during the years following my disownment. "Before we begin," he said, "I want you to understand that your grandfather spent considerable time revising his will during his final years. These weren't impulsive decisions, but carefully considered choices that reflect his deeply held values about legacy and stewardship." My parents nodded solemnly, interpreting this as confirmation that he'd structured the inheritance thoughtfully, perhaps setting aside money for taxes, establishing trusts for long-term growth, dividing assets according to their individual strengths and interests. They were completely unprepared for what came next. "The estate is valued at approximately $47 million, the lawyer continued. "This includes commercial real estate holdings, diversified investment portfolios, and liquid assets accumulated over 5 decades of disciplined financial management." The number was larger than they'd expected, larger than I'd imagined. My parents exchanged glances that mixed surprise with satisfaction. They'd be even wealthier than they'd anticipated, their financial security even more complete. "However," the lawyer said, his voice carrying the weight of a life-changing announcement, "the distribution doesn't follow conventional expectations." My father leaned forward slightly. "What do you mean?" The lawyer cleared his throat, the sound somehow final in the quiet room. "The entire $47 million estate goes to Major Natasha Morgan, United States Army, in recognition of her honorable service and embodiment of the values that guided her grandfather's life." The silence was absolute. No one moved, no one breathed, no one seemed capable of processing what they'd just heard. The words hung in the air like a physical presence, reshaping reality with their implications. My parents' faces went through a sequence of expressions: confusion, disbelief, shock, and finally a dawning horror as they realized the lawyer wasn't joking, wasn't mistaken, wasn't reading from the wrong document. "That's impossible," my mother said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm afraid it's quite definitive," the lawyer replied. "Your father was very specific about his intentions and his reasoning." My father found his voice. "There has to be a mistake. We're his children. She's been estranged from this family for 10 years. He was aware of the family dynamics. In fact, they factored heavily into his decision-making process." The lawyer opened a folder and withdrew a single sheet of paper. "He asked me to read this personal statement if there were questions about his reasoning. He cleared his throat again and began reading in my grandfather's voice, words he'd written during those final months when his health was failing, but his judgment remained sharp. To my son and daughter-in-law, you disowned Natasha for choosing honor over comfort, service over security, principle over profit. You cut her out of your lives because she wouldn't conform to your narrow definition of success. You abandoned the daughter who embodied everything I tried to teach about integrity, courage, and commitment to something greater than personal gain. In doing so, you revealed your own character more clearly than any other action could have. You chose material security over moral courage, social status over family loyalty, inherited wealth over earned respect. Natasha chose the opposite path in every instance. She's spent 10 years proving that my values weren't outdated ideals, but living principles worth sacrificing for. This inheritance goes to the family member who understands that real wealth lies in character, real success lies in service, and real legacy lies in living according to principles that transcend personal advantage. Natasha has earned this inheritance through a decade of honorable choices. You forfeited it through a single dishonorable one. The room remained silent as the lawyer folded the letter and returned it to the folder. My parents sat frozen, their faces pale, their confident expectations shattered by the reality of consequences they'd never imagined. I felt something fundamental shift inside me, not triumph, but a deep sense of justice finally served. My grandfather had been watching, judging, planning this moment for years. He'd seen through their manipulation, their calculation, their conditional love, and he'd responded with the same integrity that had defined his entire life. There are a few smaller bequests, the lawyer continued. $5,000 each to several veterans organizations, personal items distributed to old Army friends. But the bulk of the estate, the real estate, the investments, the accumulated wealth, goes to Major Morgan. My parents finally found their voices, objecting, questioning, demanding explanations that wouldn't change the legal reality. But their protests sounded hollow in the face of my grandfather's clear reasoning, their shock revealing how completely they'd misunderstood his character and values. I sat quietly through their outrage, thinking about morning conversations over coffee, afternoon talks in his study, the quiet lessons he'd taught through example rather than lecture. He'd been preparing me for this moment without my knowledge, building my character while they'd been counting his money. The inheritance wasn't just financial, it was validation, recognition, proof that the path I'd chosen was worthy of his respect and trust. More than the money, more than the property, more than the security, I'd received something they'd never offered, unconditional acceptance of who I'd chosen to become. Justice had been served with the same quiet precision my grandfather had brought to everything else. 10 years after they'd disowned me for choosing honor over their approval, he'd chosen me over their expectations. The room fell silent except for my mother's quiet sobbing and my father's muttered protests about legal challenges and undue influence. But the will was ironclad, the reasoning clear, the decision final. I walked out of that law office as one of the wealthiest women in the state, but more importantly, I walked out knowing that my grandfather's legacy would continue through someone who understood its true value. The money would provide security, opportunity, the ability to give back to causes that mattered. But the real inheritance was the validation that a life lived according to principle, service, and integrity was worth more than all the wealth my parents had spent years anticipating. My grandfather had taught me that real success couldn't be inherited, it had to be earned. Now he'd proven that real inheritance couldn't be assumed, it had to be deserved. The lesson was complete. The legacy was secure. And for the first time in 10 years, I understood exactly what family really meant. The weeks following the will reading brought a cascade of consequences I hadn't anticipated. My parents hired a team of lawyers to contest the will, claiming undue influence and questioning my grandfather's mental capacity during his final years. They filed motions, demanded investigations, and spent tens of thousands of dollars they didn't have pursuing a case that had no merit. Their attorney, a sharp-dressed man who specialized in estate disputes, laid out their argument with practiced confidence. Your grandfather was elderly, possibly medicated, certainly influenced by years of correspondence with the plaintiff. We believe we can demonstrate that this will doesn't reflect his true intentions. but the legal foundation was solid. My grandfather had worked with his lawyer for over 20 years, had undergone cognitive testing during his final illness to establish mental competency, and had documented his reasoning with the thoroughness of someone accustomed to making decisions that would be scrutinized later. More damaging to their case was the paper trail of their own behavior. Bank records showed repeated requests for loans and financial assistance. Email correspondence revealed their increasing pressure about estate planning and inheritance expectations. Phone records documented their sudden increase in contact during his illness compared to years of minimal communication before. Your parents' actions actually support the will's validity, my grandfather's lawyer explained during one of our meetings. They created a clear pattern of behavior that validates his concerns about their motivations. The irony wasn't lost on me. Their own greed had provided the evidence that would prevent them from overturning his decision. Every calculation they'd made, every manipulation they'd attempted, every dollar they'd borrowed against future inheritance had been carefully noted by a man who'd spent decades evaluating people's character under pressure. Meanwhile, I was learning what it meant to be suddenly, dramatically wealthy. The real estate portfolio alone generated more monthly income than my military salary. The investment accounts required professional management I'd never needed before. The responsibilities that came with substantial assets demanded attention I was still learning to provide. But the money also created opportunities I'd never imagined. I established a foundation focused on veteran transition services, funding programs that helped soldiers navigate civilian careers after military service. I endowed scholarships at my grandfather's alma mater for students pursuing military careers despite family opposition. I quietly paid off the mortgages of 3 Gold Star families in my unit, families whose breadwinners had been killed in action during our last deployment. These weren't grand gestures designed for public recognition. They were quiet acts of service that honored the values my grandfather had modeled, the same approach to wealth he'd taken throughout his life, using resources to create positive impact rather than personal glory. My parents' legal challenge dragged on for months, consuming their energy and their remaining savings. They'd mortgaged their house to fund the lawyers, borrowed against retirement accounts to pay court costs, and gradually alienated the few family members who might have supported their position. You have to understand, my mother pleaded during one of our few conversations during this period, this isn't about the money. It's about fairness, about family, about what he really would have wanted. But I did understand, probably better than she realized. It was exactly about the money they'd counted on, money they'd spent before receiving, money they'd assumed was their birthright rather than something to be earned. And it was about family, just not in the way she meant. It was about a family member who'd chosen values over comfort, who'd earned respect through service, who'd proven worthy of trust through a decade of honorable choices. The legal battle finally ended when their attorney withdrew from the case, citing lack of merit and their inability to pay his fees. The will stood as written, the inheritance remained intact, and my parents were left to confront the reality of consequences they'd never imagined when they disowned me 10 years earlier. Their financial situation became desperate quickly. Without my grandfather's periodic loans and the anticipated inheritance, they couldn't maintain their lifestyle. The house went into foreclosure. The country club membership lapsed. The social circle that had defined their identity began to distance itself from their obvious decline. I watched this collapse with mixed emotions, not satisfaction exactly, but a sense that justice was working itself out according to principles larger than personal revenge. They'd chosen a path that prioritized appearance over substance, calculation over compassion, inheritance over integrity. The consequences were simply the natural result of those choices. But I also recognized an opportunity to demonstrate the values my grandfather had tried to teach all of us. Real strength showed itself not in victory, but in magnanimity, not in punishment, but in mercy guided by wisdom. I approached them through their lawyer, offering a settlement that would provide basic security without rewarding their behavior. A modest trust fund that would cover reasonable living expenses, health insurance, and housing costs, enough to maintain dignity, but not enough to resume their previous lifestyle. The only conditions were that they cease all legal challenges and acknowledge publicly that the will reflected our grandfather's genuine wishes. They accepted reluctantly, bitter about the reduced circumstances, but unable to refuse the lifeline I was offering. The trust would provide security for their remaining years while ensuring they couldn't waste the money on luxury or speculation. "Why?" my father asked when we signed the final papers. "After everything we put you through, everything we said, why help us at all?" The question had a simple answer that took me months to fully understand. Because this is what he would have wanted. Not the money, he made that decision himself. But the mercy. The second chance. The opportunity to learn from mistakes rather than be destroyed by them. It was the final lesson in a decade of education about character, leadership, and the responsibilities that come with both wealth and values. My grandfather had left me more than money. He'd left me the wisdom to use it according to principles that transcended personal grievance. The foundation I established grew into something larger than I'd originally envisioned, supporting not just veteran transition services, but also programs that helped military families navigate the challenges of service life. The scholarships expanded to include academic support for military children whose parents deployed frequently. The quiet assistance to Gold Star families became a systematic program that provided long-term support rather than one-time payments. My military career continued to flourish, but now with the security of knowing I was serving by choice rather than economic necessity. The inheritance had freed me to take assignments based on professional development rather than financial considerations, to pursue leadership positions that mattered more than those that paid well, to serve with the knowledge that my future was secure regardless of military policy changes or budget cuts. 10 years after the disownment that had seemed like the end of my world, I understood it had actually been the beginning. My parents had freed me to become someone they'd never allowed me to be, someone my grandfather had always believed I could become, someone whose worth was measured in service rather than inheritance, character rather than connections, honor rather than accumulation. The money was substantial, the security it provided was real, but the true inheritance was something that couldn't be quantified in dollars, the knowledge that I'd lived according to principles worth defending, chosen values worth sacrificing for, and earned the respect of someone whose opinion mattered more than all the wealth he'd left behind. That was my grandfather's final gift, not just financial freedom, but the understanding that real wealth lay in becoming the kind of person worthy of trust, respect, and legacy. The lesson was complete, the circle closed, and the future bright with possibilities I'd earned through choices that honored both his memory and the values he'd spent a lifetime teaching. Family, I'd learned, wasn't about blood or birthright or shared genetics. It was about shared values, mutual respect, and the willingness to sacrifice for something greater than personal advantage. By that measure, I was richer than I'd ever imagined possible, and my grandfather's legacy was in exactly the right hands. 5 years after the will reading, I stood in the same cemetery where we'd buried my grandfather, but this time for a different kind of ceremony. The headstone was simple black granite, inscribed with his name, rank, and dates of service, but today it was surrounded by dozens of people whose lives he'd influenced across multiple decades. The gathering wasn't planned or formal, just an organic collection of veterans, former soldiers he'd mentored, community members he'd quietly helped, and business associates who'd respected his integrity. Someone had started the tradition of meeting at his grave on the anniversary of his death, sharing stories and keeping his memory alive. Major Morgan, said an elderly man I recognized as one of his Vietnam veterans. "Your grandfather would be proud of what you've done with the foundation." My grandson got one of those scholarships, first in our family to attend college. These conversations happened every year now, brief updates on lives improved by programs funded through my grandfather's inheritance. The Veteran Transition Services had helped over 3,000 former soldiers find civilian careers. The military family support programs had provided assistance during deployments, emergencies, and the countless small crises that defined military life. But the most meaningful impact was harder to quantify. The young officers who'd received mentorship through programs I'd established, the military children who'd gotten academic support during frequent moves, the Gold Star families who'd found community and ongoing assistance long after the initial sympathy faded. My parents attended this year's gathering, standing awkwardly at the edge of the group, still uncomfortable with the military community that had meant so much to their father. The years had aged them noticeably, the stress of financial insecurity, the embarrassment of their reduced circumstances, the gradual recognition that they'd fundamentally misunderstood the man they'd assumed would provide their security. "Natasha," my mother approached as the crowd began to disperse. "Could we talk for a moment?" We walked to a quiet section of the cemetery, away from the others. She looked smaller than I remembered, diminished by years of confronting the consequences of choices she'd made in anger and pride. "I've been thinking about what you said, about mercy and second chances," she began. "I'm not sure I understood it then, but I think I'm beginning to now. It takes time to recognize when you've been wrong about something fundamental. We were wrong about you, about your path, about what your grandfather valued." She paused, struggling with words that clearly didn't come easily. We were wrong about what mattered. The admission hung between us, not quite an apology, but perhaps the beginning of understanding. She was acknowledging not just tactical errors in handling my military career, but strategic failures in recognizing what constituted a meaningful life. "He saw something in you that we missed," she continued. "Or maybe we saw it, but we're afraid of what it meant, that our way wasn't the only way, that success couldn't be controlled or guaranteed, that real achievement required risk." I thought about the 18-year-old who'd left their house with a single bag, certain of her path but uncertain of her strength. That young woman had been seeking approval that would never come, validation that had to be earned elsewhere, family that had to be chosen rather than inherited. "The foundation work isn't charity," I said finally. "It's continuation. Carrying forward the values he lived by, using resources the way he would have wanted them used." "I know. That's what I'm beginning to understand, that he didn't leave you money. He left you responsibility. The money was just the tool." The conversation marked something new in our relationship, not reconciliation exactly, but perhaps the beginning of mutual respect. They were finally seeing me as the person I'd become rather than the daughter they'd lost, recognizing that the path they'd opposed had led to exactly the kind of life their father would have admired. As we walked back toward the gathering, I realized this too was part of my grandfather's legacy, not just the dramatic revelation at the will reading, but the slower process of family members growing into better versions of themselves, learning from mistakes, choosing growth over grievance. The inheritance had been more than financial. It had been an education in leadership, stewardship, and the patience required to help people become who they were capable of being. Some lessons took decades to complete, but the best ones were worth the wait. 3 months after that cemetery conversation, I received orders for my final military assignment, command of a training battalion at Fort Benning, responsible for developing the next generation of Army officers. It was the kind of position my grandfather would have understood perfectly, using experience to shape young leaders who would carry forward the values of service and integrity. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was now the same age he'd been when he'd started mentoring me during those morning conversations over coffee. The difference was that I had resources he'd never possessed at that age, not just financial resources, but the wisdom that came from watching his example, the confidence that came from proving myself under pressure, and the security that came from knowing my path was sustainable regardless of external circumstances. My parents surprised me by attending the change of command ceremony. They sat in the back of the auditorium, looking somewhat out of place among the military families and fellow officers, but present nonetheless. My mother had been making an effort over the past months, not to repair our relationship exactly, but to understand it differently. "I never realized how much responsibility you carried," she said afterward, watching me interact with the young officers who would serve under my command. "All those soldiers depending on your decisions, trusting your judgment. That's what leadership is. Earning trust every day through competence and character. Your grandfather tried to tell us that once. We thought he was being philosophical." The comment revealed how completely they'd misunderstood him during his lifetime. What they'd dismissed as abstract principles had been practical guidance for anyone who wanted to lead effectively, whether in military service, business, or family relationships. He'd been trying to teach them the same lessons he'd taught me, but they'd been too focused on outcomes to pay attention to process. My new position allowed me to expand the foundation's work in ways that felt personally meaningful. Working with young officers every day reminded me how crucial mentorship was during the early stages of a military career, those moments when junior leaders were forming their understanding of what service meant, what sacrifice required, what integrity looked like under pressure. I established a leadership development program that paired experienced officers with new lieutenants, not just for professional guidance, but for personal support during the challenging transition from civilian life to military responsibility. The program grew rapidly, spreading to other installations as word spread about its effectiveness. But the most rewarding aspect was watching these young leaders develop their own sense of purpose, their own understanding of what it meant to serve something greater than personal ambition. I saw my younger self in many of them, uncertain about their capabilities, but committed to their values, looking for examples of what honorable service actually looked like in practice. "Ma'am," one of my lieutenants said after a particularly difficult training exercise, "how do you know when you're making the right decision under pressure?" "You don't always know in the moment," I told her. "But if you're making decisions based on what's best for your people and the mission, rather than what's best for your career, you're usually on the right track." It was the same lesson my grandfather had taught me in different words, the same principle that had guided his estate planning, the same value that had ultimately determined who was worthy of his trust and his legacy. The cycle was continuing, knowledge passing from one generation to the next, values being transmitted through example rather than lecture, leadership being developed through practice rather than theory. My grandfather's influence was still expanding, touching lives he'd never met through programs he'd never seen, funded by wealth he'd accumulated through decades of disciplined living. Some inheritances diminished over time, divided among heirs until they lost their impact. But real legacy grew stronger as it spread, creating compound returns on investments in human character and moral courage. I was no longer just the recipient of my grandfather's inheritance. I was its active steward, multiplying its impact through careful deployment of both financial resources and accumulated wisdom. The money provided tools, but the values provided direction, and together they were creating something that would outlast all of us. Thanks for staying with me. If this hit home, tap like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs a boundary win today. Quick questions. Have you ever dealt with family entitlement or an inheritance dispute? What's one boundary you set that changed everything? Would you have offered your parents a modest safety net or cut ties completely? If you're a veteran or military family, how has service shifted your family dynamics? Drop your answers and where you're watching from in the comments. I'm reading everyone.